Hello, welcome to this little conversation monologue about Plato's Republic, the section on the character of the tyrant. So I'm just gonna kind of discuss this section and kind of think about what's going on, what's Plato trying to achieve here, what is the tyrant, how do we define the tyrant, and why is the philosopher king kind of the opposite to a tyrant? Like, why is he positing a, a tyrant as the kind of identity of the thing, which is the opposite to the philosopher king? So first thing I want to point out here is in this section is that Plato he kind of frames this and enters into this discussion um, of a kind of character analysis of people, specifically rulers. I mean, we're really talking about a certain character of people in general, but emphasizing what happens when that specific kind of character has power. So it's not really just a psychology of an ordinary citizen. It's really a psychology of human beings in a universal sense, but in a more particular sense also as they are in a position of power and authority. So secondarily, there's a common theme, recurring theme in Plato when he discusses character and virtue, which is in the context of intergenerational changes. This is really common in Plato. Like the examples I know off the top of my head, and these are just off the top of my head, are lashes, which is literally framed as I think it's Lysimachus and Melisias. I think their names are. I can't remember the exact names. They are, I think they're literally the grandchildren or the sons of, like, is it Thucydides and Aristides? Like these really, really renowned uh, Athenian men, and they're complaining that they're not as virtuous and as well accomplished as their fathers and grandfathers, and then they're asking Socrates, how can we make our sons, how can we educate our sons to be more like these great men and less, I suppose, less like these kind of men who had no great purpose or no great um, 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 uh, yeah, purpose, I suppose, within the Athenian society. They're kind of like the post-war boomers. They're kind of these people that are just there to kind of consume and kind of totter around. Um, but anyway, so there's this theme in Lashes of what is courage, and that discussion is introduced in the context of what is of intergenerational changes and changes in character between generations. Um, it's also in Statesman, the Statesman. We have this discussion um, of of kind of warlike men and unwarlike men, and then you have this warning from the stranger who says unwarlike men who inherit times of peace and prosperity. They're always ready to kind of negotiate and accommodate, and then they pass on that character trait to their sons, and then their sons kind of copy them in an inappropriate way, and then the society basically becomes kind of weak, and then it falls into a kind of slavery, or it risks falling into a kind of state of slavery. So you have this theme in Plato. He's really concerned with intergenerational changes between generations, changes between character and virtue between generations, and that's not something that anyone really talks about in Plato, but I do, because that's what I do here. Anyway, and so that is this conversation is also about the tyrant is also framed in that context, because we have this quote here. I'm going to read out 1 second. He says, suppose that the same thing happens to the son as to the father. He's drawn towards complete license, which his tempers call complete liberty. Which his tempters call complete liberty. His father and family support moderation, and his tempters come in on the other side. And when the wicked wizards who want to make him a tyrant despair of keeping their hold on the young man by other means, they contrive to implant a master passion in him to control the idle desires that divide his time between them like a great winged drone, unless you can think of a better description for such a passion, end quote. Yeah, so this passage, this discussion on the tyrant, it emerges as we see the kind of distinction between a kind of father and grandfather who are in favor of moderation, and then something happens to the son. In this case, he's being influenced by these tempters. I don't know who these tempters are. They didn't really say. We can assume, they're people. Assuming this is a kind of discussion, this very aristocratic discussion. Like it's a discussion of like sons who may have a lot of people around them. Maybe they have, I don't know who, politicians, other people from their own generation, soldiers, I don't know, artists, whoever, like, just people around them in the society who are influencing them to be more, to be more, I suppose, less moderate, less self-disciplined in this instance. So there's a change in that. There's a change in that generational character, and then he continues to say, the other desires buzz around it, loading it with incense and perfume, flowers and wine, and all the pleasures of a dissolute life, on which they feed and fatten it until at last they produce in it the sting of mania. Then the master passion runs wild and takes madness into its service. Any opinions or desires with a decent reputation and any feelings of shame still left are killed or thrown out until all discipline is swept away and madness usurps its place. So again, this disposition of the tyrant, kind of maniacal leader, it doesn't just emerge kind of out of nowhere. It emerges out of a kind of change in generational character in which we're presuming a young man. I'm going to presume this is in context to like a kind of young man. Is Greek pedagogy, Platonic pedagogy is normally concerned with like young men and how they're developing. It is concerned with this kind of basically what we might call in modern terms a kind of decadence or a decline in the character towards license, towards lack of self-control, lack of moderation, and so on and so forth. So another thing to mention about this section is that this whole section is basically framed as a competition of pleasures. You could even say a competition of vices, in the sense that Plato is talking about pleasures people engage in, and there's three of them, and kind of roughly speaking, and these three are reflective of the Platonic schema of the psyche, the soul, spirit, desire, and reason. And the pleasures are the purest pleasure, which is the pleasure in truth seeking and knowledge seeking. The second pleasure, which is the love of honor, love of glory. And the third, lowest one, is love of profit, gain. We could say probably like physical gratification, pleasure, getting drunk, having certain kinds of sex, and so on and so forth. So these are the three pleasures. Now, it's interesting to note that truth seeking is not described as like something which is not pleasurable. It's not simply like truth seeking is hard and painful and getting drunk is pleasurable. Like they're all, in a sense, kind of human inclinations. They're all potentially pleasurable or potentially painful in some way or another. And it's simply that truth seeking is the kind of highest, purest form of pleasure seeking. One key distinction between these kind of pleasures, these inclinations, is that we can assume that truth seeking for Plato is something which requires the most discipline and the most virtue. Anyone can really get drunk, right? I mean, like anyone can get drunk, anyone can eat junk food, anyone can have sex. it's not really anything special. Like it doesn't take a lot of discipline, virtue, skill, whatever, to do that. Love of honor. It starts to change with love of honor. Honor becomes something which, to be honorable, you might have to have like some sort of moral principles. You may have to be courageous. You may have to be able to deal with confrontation or conflict. You may have to deal with to overcome certain pains, endure certain things, and so on and so forth. So, and then of course, truth seeking is something which I think Plato at least would argue requires, again, the most virtue, standard of virtue, moderation, self-control, and so on and so forth. So there's a kind of hierarchy to these pleasures in which they may all be described as pleasurable, but they're not all equally accessible. The closer you get to the philosopher king, the more, I suppose, difficult and inaccessible his pleasures are. So the tyrant is again here expressed as something who is not just tyrannical. Like the problem really is distinct from, I would say, modern psychology. Plato psychology is distinct from modern psychology in the sense that I think modern psychology basically tries to understand a kind of universal human subject. It's like, if Sigmund Freud or Carl Jung is talking about the human mind, there's age and gender distinctions within cutting through that kind of universal psyche, but we generally don't talk about like his role in society or her role in society. They just take into account, like, I would say at the most they take into account like age, gender, like it's kind of a biological, ontological distinctions. But with Plato, you get here a psychology which is also interested in the role of the person in a society. Whenever we're talking about, for example, the courageous man, we're normally talking about someone who is expressing a certain part of the psyche, but also he's expressing a certain role within society or a certain need that society has. Whether or not he's actually part of like a warrior caste is like another thing, but it's kind of evident that societies, to some extent or another, require this character and require this role. So when we're talking about Plato's psychology, it's kind of its idea of a psyche, this kind of universal psyche, is cut between the kind of particular functions and roles and needs of a social order, which I think is distinct from modern psychology. I think modern psychology does that part very well. And so anyway, so here we have a description of how the tyrannical character is bad insofar that it's sort of exaggerated in its vice or in its stupidity or in its indiscipline by its role or by its authority. So I'll just read the passage. The tyrannical character, therefore, whom you judge to be the most wretched of men because of the harvest of evils produced by the disorder prevailing within him, is in all these ways still worse off when he ceases to be a private citizen and is compelled by fate to become a real tyrant and to control others, though he cannot control himself. It's just as if you compelled an invalid or a paralytic to spend his life on military service or in athletic competitions instead of living quietly at home. End quote. So yeah, again, there's this sort of like incongruity or out of placeness, which Plato emphasizes here. The fact that the tyrant it may have the exact same character, but if he's a private person sitting at home, it's not a tyrant. It's a tyrant when someone who can't control themselves or doesn't have any virtue, for example, has the capacity to control and influence others. Now, what we mean by control and influence is another question here, because I think Plato means more than just, than just like telling people what to do or coming up with some rules of behavior and so on. I think he's really thinking about how I think you'd have to go deeper into kind of social psychology here to really understand what Plato means by this. Like, for example, how we identify, like we might identify with our fathers or with celebrities or with older brothers or with friends, those people, those models, we could say, have a certain character to them, and then we mimic them. And what's creating those specific characters? What are they expressing within them? Like, is like a rock star, for example, is certainly to some extent, well, he's an artistic person, right? He's a sort of showman and a performer and an entertainer, but he's also to some extent expressing the erotic, appetitive aspects to the psyche. A soldier, a hero, a warrior, that person is clearly expressing the spirited aspect of the psyche. And then you have the philosopher king, obviously, who doesn't really exist until Plato talks about him, right? At least not concretely. There are people like Pythagoras, who kind of had a kind of philosophy king-ish existence. At least he was a philosopher who had a significant amount of social influence. So but I suppose the philosopher king is somebody who it's more like the kind of good leader, the statesman. It's less obvious, sort of, to give a caricature of the philosopher king. Like he represents, I suppose, a harmony of different aspects of the psyche and so forth. So the philosopher king isn't really an expression of one particular part of the psyche. He's supposed to be a representation of reason, but we shouldn't confuse this with like a representation of rationality, like a machine is a representation of rationality, or maybe like a technocrat is an expression of rationality. He's an expression of a reason, insofar that reason is the thing which harmonizes the other parts of the psyche. He orders, structures, hierarchically orders and structures those other parts of the psyche to be in order. So he's a reflection of, and he's a sort of social reflection of, a harmonized psychic and metaphysical and social order. So that's really most of what this section is about. At the very end, you kind of have this funny kind of mathematical account of how miserable the tyrant is, and he's like 729 times more unhappy than the philosopher king. Right? So you have this kind of mathematical equation which you can go through. It's short, and it basically comes to the conclusion that, like, the philosopher king is 29 times, according to this little note here, happier than the tyrant. So the tyrant's not happy. He's not a happy man. He may have power, but he has no control over his own inner state, and he's making his society worse, which is then, I suppose, in turn making him worse. In what sense is that making him worse? That's the question. Like, is there some sort of internal innate misery caused by making your society worse, or is it? That would probably be the kind of more metaphysical argument. The more sociological argument might be something like, well, if you make your society miserable, then in turn you have to live in your society, and your society makes you miserable. I don't know. Like, I think Plato's probably more drawn towards the metaphysical idea that, like, that there's a kind of predetermination of happiness and misery, which is caught into a hierarchy of virtues and impulses and so forth. But the thing I wanted to bring up a little bit here, because I've written about this before, is the fact that by all accounts, the tyrant is really described as a man who has no control of his erotic and appetitive impulses. There's one or two small allusions to him having, being too ambitious, being ambitious in a way which is separated from reason. So we're not talking about being ambitious being in any way bad, or being kind of a love of honor being bad. It's just that once it's severed from reason, it can be damaging. Um, the the uh, the real focus, the really tyrannical impulses in psychology that Plato is concerned with here, is the appetitive ones. Um, uh, they're at the bottom of the hierarchy here, and if you know more about Plato's psychology from his other dialogues, you'll know that the spirit, ambition, thymos, has a certain function in helping regulate appetite. So, for example, if you think of it, if you think of addiction, rationality cannot regulate addiction on its own. Like, people will only stop taking a drug, for example, because they feel something called shame. They feel a sort of shame. Now, of course, you can feel ashamed about things for the wrong reasons. There are, like, good sorts of shames and bad sorts of shames. But the fact that we do have this feeling called shame, it's a kind of sense of honor or indignity, which kind of, it's a very, and it's kind of an emotional force. It's an irrational force. It's an irrational emotional force, which indicates that we're not good enough, that we've done something wrong, that our soul in some sense is not harmonized properly, and this is a irrational impulse which the rational, reasonable mind, nous, must work with in order to control appetite. Nous cannot control appetite on its own, and you also do, on the other hand, need reason in order to control spirit, because an excessively honor-loving man could also act in a kind of way which fails to be properly harmonized and so forth. But it's worth stating that this is the exact opposite to what the modern world has become with liberal capitalism, in which really it's honor which is the ultimate vice of our time. And it's even though, like, you can never get rid of this, and people feel lots of feelings of shame and honor and pride all the time because it's just a human thing, but really it's like, as opposed to classical psychology, which gives allowances to feelings of anger, feelings of shame and pride. It gives allowances to these irrational forces, while the modern world gives allowances to the appetite of erotic forces, right? The sexual revolution, capitalism, these are all the appetite of erotic tendencies, and the set of indulgences are really more are really sort of given to this part of the psyche. I would recommend watching The Century of the Self by what's his name, Adam Curtis, because it really describes how in the kind of 20th century, particularly after World War II, there was could only be described as like a global conspiracy between reason and appetite. The setting up of the modern consumer, the global market, modern capitalism, this kind of Americanization of everywhere, and it's basically a massive indulgence campaign for appetite, pleasure, and so forth. And not only that you could even go so far to claim that the spirited aspect of our psyche, of our soul, of our society, started to become the thing which became lowest in the hierarchy. It became something which we were particularly suspicious and controlling of, right? Militarism, which is an aspect of the spirited side of the soul, became the worst thing. To compare Plato's tyrant, Plato's psychology of the tyrant, to, for example, I think it's Marcuse's authoritarian character. Marcuse will claim that the authoritarian character is something which is kind of repressive. There's a kind of sexual repressivity. There's an incorporation of psychoanalysis into that, and there's a claim that fascism, for example, is the product of a kind of sexual repressivity, which basically means honor, spirit. It's a pathology of that side of the psyche. And then the role of the politician, of the philosopher, of the kind of social planner, of the journalist, and so forth, and then of course of the capitalist and of the marketer, is to degrade spirit, control spirit, contain spirit, and liberate appetite. And that's basically like that's basically like the middle to the end of the 20th century in a nutshell. There's basically like a total reversal of the classical of classical psychology happens in the 20th century. And the role, therefore, of the politician, of the social leader, of the philosopher, even a kind of new priestly class, of whatever you want to call them, like advertisers, kind of public commentators, journalists, culture creators, artists to some extent. These people come in and they perform an enormous indulgence campaign on appetite, and it is quite directly like an inversion of classical psychology. And when I say classical, I don't mean like classical modern psychology. I mean like literally Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics. The Stoics are a bit different, of course, but they more or less do have this sense of anger being more noble a vice than appetite. I think there's a quote from Marcus Aurelius which says something like that anger comes from pain, and therefore it's more noble, even though it's a vice and it has to be subdued and controlled by reason. It is a more noble vice than pleasure. So you have this sense in the classical psychology of yes, reason is still the highest, but and it's still in charge, but you have a kind of hierarchy of vices, and some vices are helpful for reason and necessary for reason to control other vices. Whereas in the modern world, you don't really have a kind of hierarchy of vices, right? You just have an indulgence of some vices and a kind of excessive restriction of others. So I guess there is a kind of hierarchy there, but it's not explicitly a hierarchy. So the other thing which might be worth mentioning is the tendency for these vices to the way in which we relate to vice and indulgence, and how a certain mechanism of doing so, if it's embodied in a person of authority, causes like the most harm. So again, I don't think we shouldn't read Plato here as like some sort of kind of prudent, puritanical moralist who just wants to control everyone's behavior. He's talking about what happens when authority itself, leadership, power itself, is driven by people with a specific kind of character, for example, if you have a bunch of rulers and leaders who are all total sexual perverts, that's going to affect the society because there's a kind of psychopolitical schema and structure to that authority. If you have a ruling class who are all these like really militant, warlike warriors, like it's like Dark Age Scandinavia, you're gonna have another completely different kind of character trait of authority. And I think for Plato, what he's trying to get at here is that like a successful civilization, a successful society, is run by people who are the expression of a harmonized psychic state. The character of the rulers is really, really key and really important in order to actually have an effective effective ruling class, basically. So the philosopher king, therefore, is, as I said earlier, he's an expression of a kind of harmonized psychic state within his within himself, but he's also trying to reproduce that state in other people. Like he's supposed to regulate and govern a society so that harmonic teleology, that harmonic capacity, can reproduce itself and follow itself. And again, when you have, for example, a bunch of people who are completely controlled by their appetite of vices and passions and have no control over that, if those are the kind of people running the society, then they're probably going to reproduce that structure and that character in the society itself. So there's this kind of reproductive force within a society which comes from the character structure. And again, to take capitalism as an example, you probably have you could probably make the argument that, structurally speaking, like, we live in a society in which we are not simply by moral choice living a life which is full of vice in appetite and acquisition. We're sort of drawn into that society by the structural logic of that society, and there is a lot of truth to that. Like, but at the same time, I think for Plato, there's a kind of reciprocal element here that, like, that the character of the ruling classes sort of reproduces the conditions for its own character, and then those structures start to reinforce its own character, if that makes sense. In other words, capitalism produces greedy people because it indulges greed, and it therefore reproduces the kind of structure and the logic and the character of its ruling class. And again, if you looked at the documentary Century for the Self, you really see this. Like, you really see this play out. There's this group of people, and you have Edward Bernays, who's Freud's nephew, who studies modern psychology, and he is employed by corporations and by the government to run certain marketing campaigns. And you really see in that time that it wasn't just the companies wanted to sell people stuff. I mean, of course they did. That's what companies do. But these companies were also seen as, at least like kind of mass consumption was seen as a way, in a sort of historical reaction to World War II, it was seen as a way to sort of control these dangerous forces of, like, nationalism, fascism. Obviously, it was also antagonistic to communism, which communism wants to kind of contain and regulate our appetite of vices. Communism actually has an element of Platonism within it, as does fascism. Actually, they're both much more Platonic than liberal capitalism, which is probably the least Platonic form of society that's ever existed. But anyway, the point is that you see these sort of incentive structures and this kind of psychology being reproduced in the Century of the Self by these advertisers and these marketers. And it's justified not just on the basis of selling stuff, but on the basis of actually creating a kind of morally good society. Like the idea after World War II, the idea of, like, a society of consumers was seen as, like, seen as a kind of aspirational state to be in. It wasn't just like, oh, well, look, we don't have as many rules and stringent codes around consumption and appetite and sexuality anymore. It was it wasn't just a lack of rules. It was like the kind of consumerist world we live in today was constructed, kind of architecturally, by people who thought that the indulgence and liberation of appetite would lead to a society which was free from bad things like, war and nationalism and racism and all this stuff, right? And what's interesting about our society today is that, like, I think Plato's really being redeemed here a lot, because we do have an oligarchical society. Like, this association which post-war types like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and others had with, like, capitalism, which basically on psychopolitical terms means an indulgent system of appetite, is compatible with freedom and reason, and democracy. This is clearly not worked out very well. I mean, think about how oligarchical our society has gotten. Think about how unhappy we are. Like, we're all these unhappy tyrants today. We're all we're all 729 times more miserable than the Philosopher King, because we all have this kind of world where at the click of our fingers we can engage in, like, virtual unlimited supply of virtual pornographic stimulation. We can consume as much as we want, and so on and so forth. We all have kind of access nearly to kind of Plato's tyrant, to this sort of unlimited, undisciplined appetite of existence. We all have access to that today. We've democratized Plato's tyrant. I think I might call this video that the democratization of Plato's tyrant. We've democratized Plato's tyrant, who back in Plato's time, right, and for most of human history, the only people that would have enough access to, like, all these luxuries and as much wine as they want, and as much kind of food, or even sexual partners as they want. These would only be like aristocrats, really. At the end of the day, you're not really going to even have access. Like, you're not going to have the conditions possible to be a tyrant on Plato's terms back in the day if you're just like some peasant. I know they didn't have peasants back then, but if you're just some farm worker, you're not going to have access for that. But nowadays, with modern consumerism, like, we're all Plato's tyrants. We've all got access to an undisciplined and imbalanced appetite of supremacy. So yeah, that's just a little bit on Plato's Tyrant. I hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe if you haven't already.